I'd like to start off by thanking Dr. Orient for inviting me back to speak here again, this time on HIV/AIDS. Modern medicine functions under the stricture of 5 paradigms that have attained the status of state-sanctioned dogma. But I'm happy to report that the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness has debunked 4 of these. By my count, 3 previous presentations on HIV/AIDS, one by the leading critic Peter Duesberg, one on cholesterol and saturated fats that I gave here several years ago, 4 papers on the health damaging effects of vaccines, and 16 papers on the linear no threshold theory, plus 3 more dealing with this subject at this meeting. In 1981, the CDC alerted the medical world to an outbreak of a rare kind of pneumonia and sarcoma in 160 gay men in New York and Orange County, California. HIV/AIDS began as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, the name given to this cluster of cases. In a study of 20 homosexual men with Kaposi sarcoma, Marmor and colleagues found that all of them used poppers, inhaled amyl nitrite, compared to 68% of controls, comprising 40 gay men without this disease. The affected group also used a lot of other drugs more frequently. The gay men who had Kaposi sarcoma were found to be quite promiscuous, averaging 10 different partners a month. One fellow admitted to having 90 different partners a month. Marmor and colleagues also found a highly significant association between Kaposi sarcoma and frequent unprotected receptive anal sex. Rectal endothelium is only 1 cell thick, and semen, when absorbed, is immunosuppressive. In 1982, in the New York Native, Mike Callan and Richard Berkowitz wrote what has turned out to be the most explosive and controversial article ever published in the gay press, titled, "We Know Who We Are. 2 gay men declare war on promiscuity." They write, "The motto of promiscuous gay men has been, so many men, so little time. In the 70s, we worried about so many men. In the 80s, we will have to worry about so little time." And we can say from our experience that changing from an obsessively promiscuous lifestyle is extremely difficult. Even believing as strongly as we do about the risks of promiscuity, we have been tempted to return to the circuit. Old habits die hard. But once one has looked death in the face and seen pneumocystis carinii pneumonia patients in isolation and witnessed the suffering of Kaposi sarcoma victims, change becomes easier. But they add, quote, "We are not suggesting legislating an end to promiscuity. Ultimately, it may be more important to let people die in the pursuit of their own happiness than to limit personal freedom by regulating risk." In an interview with AIDS journalist Celia Farber, Mike Callan said, "By the time I was 25, I figure I had sex with 3,000 people. I had every sexual transmitted disease you can imagine, several times, bacterial infections, parasitic infections, with unending rounds of antibiotics. This is not to speak of the drugs we use. There is no mystery here about why we are getting sick. AIDS is a multifactorial syndrome, but straight people can't bring themselves to talk about what these factors are, and gay people don't want them to." In July 1982, the CDC dropped the name GRID down the Orwellian memory hole and replaced it with AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It published a list of 12 AIDS-defining diseases shown here, consisting of various opportunistic diseases and cancer. We know that pneumocystis carinii pneumonia is caused by a fungus, and Kaposi sarcoma is not a cancer. A particular herpes virus causes it. These are all old diseases affecting people that have become immunocompromised. Moritz Kaposi described the supposed sarcoma named after him in 1872. And two Dutch investigators first described pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in 1942 in 2 infants and a 20-year-old adult. At a press conference on April 23, 1984, the government Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, announced that a virus is the probable cause of AIDS, a retrovirus which came to be named HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. Along with these two things, that, quote, a new process has been developed to mass produce the virus, and we now have a blood test that can identify AIDS victims with 100% certainty. The government announced this germ cause of AIDS before any studies had been published on it. The new disorder came into existence by government fiat. Gay leaders abandoned the multifactorial risk factor of AIDS. If caused by a sexually transmitted virus, then AIDS is everybody's disease, also affecting heterosexual men and women. In this current era of gay liberation, pointing a finger at the lifestyle of homosexual men raises sensitivities. Better to go with the no-blame virus from hell cause of AIDS. AIDS investigator Joan Shenton puts it this way, quote, once HIV was accepted as the cause of AIDS by the majority of gay men, a certain sense of relief entered their lives. They had seen many of their lovers and closest friends waste away before their eyes. Now they could grieve for them, knowing that HIV, this strange, novel virus said to have come from Africa, had caused the death of their loved ones. Anyone challenging the now accepted viral cause of death was deeply resented and quickly labeled homophobic. That was a sacrilege. In 1987, the CDC revised its clinical definition of AIDS to now include 25 diseases. The CDC added 4 more AIDS indicator diseases to its list in 1992. Now you could be perfectly healthy and still have AIDS if you were found to be HIV positive and your T-cell count was below a certain level. Pulmonary tuberculosis was added. If you had tuberculosis and you were HIV negative, you had tuberculosis. If you have TB and you are HIV positive, you have AIDS. The CDC added cervical cancer to the list, perhaps as a way to increase the number of women having AIDS, since men continue to comprise 90% of all AIDS victims. With the addition of a low T-cell count, 61% of all new cases of AIDS are now healthy people with no disease. AZT was the first drug the FDA approved in 1987 for treating people who are HIV positive. We know now that its approval was based on fraudulent research, on trials that became unblinded and were terminated prematurely. This drug was first employed for cancer chemotherapy, but proved too toxic, and oncologists stopped using it. The patient cited on this slide, although healthy, took AZT after he was found to be HIV positive. Intolerable side effects made him stop taking it 2 years later. He then developed a lymphoma and died. It turns out that people who take AZT for 3 years have a 46.4% probability of developing lymphoma. An international conference on AIDS was held in Berlin in 1993 when AZT was at its height. But that year, the Concord study was published, which showed that AZT was not effective and was, in fact, shortening lives. This drew a handful of dissidents to the conference. A man stood outside the conference with a sign that read, translated in English, "To the devil, AZT," in an action reminiscent of Hitler's SA and its gay leader Ernst Röhm in 1933, 60 years earlier. In 1993, a mob of gay men called ACT UP attacked the sign holder, beat him up, cracked his sign in half, and set his stack of anti-AZT flyers on fire while a security guard stood by and watched. The drug company that makes AZT, Burroughs Wellcome, flew its gay members first class to Berlin and put them up in one of the city's best hotels. On the first day of the conference, a Dutch man deposited a stack of articles in the press room that quoted Luc Montagnier, who later won the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV. Montagnier did not believe that HIV alone caused AIDS. Armed guards confiscated the stack of articles, forcibly took the man out of the conference center, and authorities expelled him from the country. This slide shows the number of AIDS cases, deaths, and funding during its first 20 years in America. The number of people who are HIV positive, however, has stayed at less than 1 million up through today, while the population has grown from 235 million to 319 million. In the period 1988 to 1996, there were 235,000 recorded AIDS deaths. AZT caused more than 96% of them, with 140,000 of these deaths occurring in HIV-positive young gay men aged 20 to 44 years old. I had what one might call an elite education at Dartmouth and Harvard, and surgical training at 3 hospitals affiliated with Columbia University. Then I moved to Seattle and joined the surgical faculty at the University of Washington. But like my colleagues there, and is the case with most doctors, I lived in a knowledge cocoon, wrapped around adult heart surgery, and did not question the received wisdom that a virus causes AIDS. I read little about it and accepted what infectious disease specialists told us to do if we were to prick our fingers with a needle or get cut with a knife. When I performed heart surgery on HIV-positive patients, I would put on 2 pairs of gloves, and the surgical team would be extra careful handling needles and knives. This changed in 1996, when my wife and I went to our favorite bookstore in Seattle and heard Dr. Peter Duesberg, professor of molecular and cell biology at the University of California in Berkeley, talk about his new book, Inventing the AIDS Virus. I bought a copy and read it. Dr. Duesberg shows that the germ theory of AIDS fails a key test, Koch's 4 postulates for identifying the causative agent of a particular disease. The first, the germ causing the disease must be found in all cases of the disease, but not with HIV/AIDS. A person can have a low T cell count or any of the AIDS-defining diseases and be HIV negative. Orthodox health authorities, unable to ignore such cases, have invented a label for them. It is idiopathic CD4 lymphocytopenia, ICL. Second, as regarding isolating the virus, with HIV it can't be done. Dr. Etienne de Harven, who published the first electron microscopy picture of a retrovirus, notes, no one has ever observed by electron microscopy one single retroviral particle in the blood of HIV/AIDS patients. He writes, all the images of particles supposedly representing HIV and published in the scientific as well as lay publications derive from EM studies of cell cultures. They never show HIV particles coming directly from an AIDS patient. The pictures are always embellished by computerized image reconstruction and with attractive and refined 3D effects. As he points out, 8% of the human genome is human endogenous retroviruses, which can be easily mistaken for HIV. With regard to the third and fourth postulates, blood from AIDS patients injected into chimpanzees do not give them AIDS or make them HIV positive. And as for injecting drugs with dirty needles, it turns out there are studies that show using clean needles has a higher incidence of causing HIV positive status than being HIV negative. And this virus lives happily fused with the DNA in human T cells. It infects less than 1 in 10,000 T cells and lives in the body happily and doesn't kill them. The next stage of my education with HIV/AIDS occurred in 2003 at the 21st meeting of the DDP in Phoenix, where Willie Soon talked about climate change, Howard Idso on CO2, and David Rasnick on the causes of AIDS. I wrote an article for LouRockwell.com about this meeting titled Finding Truth in Phoenix. Its conclusion reads, the three truths discussed here on climate change, carbon dioxide, and AIDS share one thing in common, as do other truths found at this meeting. They all correct flawed hypotheses and models that have resulted from government involvement in science and medicine. Dr. Rasnick presented the findings of a key paper he wrote with Drs. Duesberg and Kohnlein, published in the Journal of Biosciences, titled The Chemical Basis of Various AIDS Epidemics. These investigators show that HIV is an innocuous passenger virus, that AIDS is not contagious, and therefore not treatable with antiviral drugs or vaccines. At this point, 20 years into the alleged AIDS epidemic, spreading psychological terror and toxic treatment, the scientific truth, as opposed to the politically perceived truth, as Dr. Robinson would put it, is that a virus does not cause AIDS. Other things cause immune deficiency. Duesberg et al. Discussed 3 of them in their Journal of Biosciences paper: heavy-duty use of recreational drugs, antiviral drugs, and malnutrition. Another cause of AIDS, which people don't like to talk about, particularly straight people, as Mike Callan notes, is promiscuous anal sex. 2004, this book was published, Oncogenes, Aneuploidy, and AIDS, A Scientific Life and Times of Peter H. Duesberg, by Harvey Bailey, a molecular biologist and founding scientific editor of the journal Nature Biotechnology. I went down to visit him in Cuernavaca, Mexico, where he was then living, and wrote an article about it for LouRockwell.com. This is what my colleague Gerald Pollack, professor of bioengineering at the UW, has to say about it. I'll read it. The book reminds us that although $100 million has been spent on AIDS research, not a single AIDS patient has been cured. A colossal failure with tragic consequences. It explains in 2 clear terms the reasons why AIDS research focuses so single-mindedly on this lone hypothesis to the exclusion of all others: ego, prestige, and money. Mainstream biologists have assumed the power of the purse, and their self-interest, sometimes financial, propel them to suppress challenges. This is not an unusual story. Challenges to mainstream views are consistently suppressed by mainstream scientists who have a stake in maintaining the status quo. It's not just Semmelweis and Galileo, but it's happening broadly in today's scientific arena. Dr. Pollack has done groundbreaking work on the structure of water, which he describes in his book, The Fourth Phase of Water, Beyond Solid, Liquid, and Vapor. He'd be a good one, Jane, to come speak to us here. During his first 20 years, a number of good books have been written about AIDS. 6 of them are shown here. Robert Rood Bernstein, the author of Rethinking AIDS, is a professor of physiology at Michigan State University. Eleanor Burkett is a university history professor who switched to journalism. Infectious AIDS, Having Been Misled, is another good one by Peter Duesberg. Neville Hodgkinson, author of AIDS, The Failure of Contemporary Science, is a journalist with the UK Sunday Times. Joan Shenton is a medical journalist and producer of documentaries on health issues. And Christine Majori, who wrote What if everything you thought about AIDS was wrong? Charming young woman was found to be HIV positive, questioned authority, became a well-informed author and HIV dissident. In 2006, journalist Celia Farber wrote an article that Harper's published titled "Out of Control: AIDS and the Corruption of Medical Science," which she included in her book, Serious Adverse Events and Uncensored History of AIDS. This article created quite a furor, but it soon died down, and the corruption in AIDS science and HIV care that she exposed was not addressed or corrected, nor, as its cover article advocated, was Bush impeached. In 2006, Dr. Duesberg and I gave talks at a Lou Rockwell conference in Foster City, California. I didn't know it at the time, but Foster City in the Bay Area is the home of the politically connected pharmaceutical company Gilead, the worldwide revenue leader in HIV drug sales, with more than $9 billion of sales in 2013. Donald Rumsfeld was chairman of Gilead when he resigned to become Secretary of Defense in 2001. Now, while most pharmaceutical companies are named after their founders, the name Gilead comes from the Bible, from Jeremiah 8:22, which reads, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?" Well, I was one physician there giving a talk on iodine and fluoride, and Peter Duesberg gave one showing why that biblically named drug company should not even exist. In 2007, two important books on HIV/AIDS were published, one by Rebecca Coleshaw, an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of Texas at Tyler. The other one, The Origin, Persistence, and Failings of HIV/AIDS Theory, is by Henry Bauer. He is Professor Emeritus of Chemistry and Science Studies and Dean Emeritus of Arts and Sciences at Virginia Tech. A reviewer of Coleshaw's book, Science Sold Out, writes, noting the long-recognized near impossibility of isolating HIV particles, even from advanced AIDS patients, Coleshaw remarks, the farcical concept of viral load was invented to create the illusion of correcting that embarrassing fact. The book demonstrates that the entire theoretical edifice of HIV/AIDS is an illusion, a vast farce, now a faith, the greatest blunder in the history of medicine. It will forever shame what we today accept as science, that a courageous young mathematician armed with one brief volume can so easily discredit 20 years of Earth's most advanced research enterprise. Regarding Dr. Bauer's book, the late Joel Kaufman makes this important point. One of the most difficult things to write is a refutation of a massive fraud, especially a health fraud, in the face of research cartels, media control, and knowledge monopolies by financial powerhouses. The obstacles to dumping the dogma are clearly highlighted as Dr. Bauer discusses the near impossibility of having so many organizations recant, partly because of the record number of lawsuits that would arise. In 2009, the group Rethinking AIDS held a conference in Oakland. All the leading AIDS dissidents were there, except Harvey Bailey, who was sick, and Rebecca Coleshaw, who was laying low. This group made a brochure they handed out at the conference. I have one here called The AIDS Trap, and it encourages people to refuse to have an HIV test. It begins, a positive result on an HIV test will change your life forever. You could lose friends, your relationships, your health insurance, your job, the custody of your children, even your sanity. The true facts of AIDS are these. An HIV status may indicate and accompany immune deficiency, but is not its cause. Heterosexual sex does not transmit HIV or cause AIDS, as evidenced by the fact that drug-free prostitutes and porn stars do not become HIV positive. And the predicted heterosexual AIDS pandemic never did happen. Less than 1 million people in the U.S. are HIV positive, and this prevalence has dropped somewhat over the last 30 years. And now, entering its fourth decade, AIDS remains confined to its two original risk groups: promiscuous gay men, accounting for close to 2/3 of the cases, and drug addicts, 1/3. But what about Africa? Following the World Health Organization Bangui definition, a person can have AIDS without being tested for HIV. If you lose weight, have a cough, some diarrhea, and a recurrent fever, you could be diagnosed as having AIDS and be a candidate for antiretroviral drugs, while still remaining underfed and having to drink bad water. In 2009, Duesberg and his co-authors submitted a paper titled HIV/AIDS Hypothesis Out of Touch with South African AIDS, a New Perspective, to the journal Medical Hypotheses. Accepted, and while in press, the journal posted the paper online on its website. It critiques a Harvard study which estimates 330,000 South African AIDS deaths occurred each year in the period 2000 to 2005. No actual count took place. That could have been prevented with antiretroviral drugs. Duesberg in this paper show that rather than decrease, the sub-Saharan African population has markedly increased from 400 million in 1980 to 800 million in 2007, and up to 1.1 billion now. In Uganda, where 15% of Ugandan men are HIV positive, overpopulation has become a central concern. The population has tripled during the AIDS era, increasing from 12 million in 1980 to 37 million in 2013. The HIV/AIDS cartel didn't like hearing this and attacked it. It went after Elsevier, the publisher of Medical Hypotheses, demanding that make this paper disappear. Elsevier, which also publishes 187 other medical and scientific journals, complied. It fired the editor of Medical Hypotheses and stopped publishing this journal for several months until it could find and appoint a more compliant editor. During my 40-year cardiac surgery career, I used a lot of bank blood, some 8,000 to 9,000 units in 6,000 heart surgeries. And now retired and having a rare blood type, B negative, I decided to start donating blood every 2 months. I had never had an HIV test and knew that when you donate blood, you must agree to be tested for HIV before the Red Cross can process it. I agreed. Then Peter Duesberg sent me an article just published in a public health journal, Frontiers in Public Health, written by Patricia Goodson, a junior faculty member at the Department of Health and Kinesiology at Texas A&M. This 8,000-word paper challenges 4 categories of data orthodox scholars use to support HIV/AIDS. They are viral markers, HIV antibodies and viral load, transmission electron microscopy of images of retroviruses, efficacy of antiviral drugs, and epidemiological studies. It is a powerful piece. She writes, quote, "The scientific establishment worldwide insistently refuses to re-examine the HIV/AIDS hypothesis, even though it is becoming increasingly more difficult to accept." And this paper represents a call to reflect upon our public health practice vis-a-vis HIV/AIDS. The debate between orthodox and unorthodox scientists comprises much more than an intellectual pursuit or a scientific skirmish. It is a matter of life and death. It is a matter of justice. Millions of lives worldwide have been and will be significantly affected by an HIV or AIDS diagnosis. If we, the public health workforce, lose sight of the social justice implication and the magnitude of the effect, we lose the very purpose of our mission. A healthy blood donor who tests positive for HIV will be put on a treatment regimen that adheres to these government guidelines. A provider will start the person on a 3-drug antiviral protocol known as 2 nukes and a 3rd drug. on a regimen of ones like those shown here. The FDA so far has approved 28 antiretroviral drugs. They are toxic. The majority of people who take them experience unpleasant side effects, shown here. Liver failure is the leading cause of death in HIV positive who take these drugs, followed by cancer in 30%. Henry Bauer has compiled a thorough 28-page online brief titled The Case Against HIV, which has 51 pages of references, 896 of them. HIV doctors blame the virus for the liver failure and cancer that afflict HIV-positive people taking antiviral drugs. Dr. Bauer provides substantial evidence which backs the opposite conclusions. The HIV drugs doctors prescribe are what cause fatal liver failure and cancer in these patients. They are what the medical profession calls iatrogenic diseases, diseases that doctors themselves cause from the treatments they use. There are many things usually ignored that can cause a false positive HIV test, including various vaccinations. For those of you who like vaccinations, don't get an HIV test. Multiparous pregnancy, and African ancestry. For example, 43% of people with lupus will test positive for HIV. Two new developments in the world of HIV care, if you can believe it, are pre-exposure prophylaxis, PrEP, promoting universal coverage with antiviral drugs to prevent HIV infections, which means we all should be taking antiviral drugs. The other one is pay for performance for patients, the acronym P4P4P, giving patients financial incentives to get tested and keep on taking the antiviral drugs. The journal that published Patricia Goodson's article is a Swiss-based open access journal, one which Elsevier does not publish, like they did with Duisberg et al.'s paper on African AIDS. The HIV/AIDS cartel demanded that the Swiss head of Frontiers in Public Health withdraw Dr. Goodson's article. Instead, this journal invited an AIDS acolyte to write a commentary on it. It chose Seth Kalichman, professor of social psychology at the University of Connecticut, to do this. This prominent attack bull for the AIDS establishment starts his commentary with this sentence: "The earth is spherical. The Holocaust occurred. Man did walk on the moon. C2 emissions are warming the planet, and yes, HIV causes AIDS." He is, of course, wrong on three things: on HIV, on CO2, and the earth is ellipsoidal, not spherical. Kalichman dismisses Dr. Goodson's critique with comments like these. She cites, quote, "no credible evidence, makes fraudulent claims, her views are myopic, and they evade and deny reality." Nowhere in his relatively short 1,300-word commentary does he confront any of the valid challenges she raises against this hypothesis. An HIV/AIDS critic is an AIDS denialist, a label he repeats 13 times, and the tagline, AIDS denialism, 5 times. He mainly makes ad hominem attacks on AIDS critics. Kalichman writes elsewhere, "So what can we do about AIDS denialism? There will always be crazy people who say crazy things. AIDS denialists only do harm when people listen to them." His response shows that the only card HIV/AIDS priests have to play to counter critiques of the hypothesis is personal disparagement and taking refuge in the circular argument that those who dissent from orthodoxy are thereby discredited. Hence, there's no credibility to their dissent. Dr. Goodson's 2014 review is proving to be a victory for HIV truth. Despite the pressure put on it, the Public Health Journal that published her paper has refused to retract it. The full text of the article remains online, freely available, and so far more than 25,000 people have downloaded it. But under cartel pressure, the journal did 2 unfortunate things. It no longer calls her paper, as it should, a hypothesis and theory article, which is more appropriate than what it is now called an opinion article. Her critique is an open-minded report without prejudice and is not an opinion piece. And the journal moved this abstract into the body of the paper as its first paragraph, making it unacceptable to abstracting services like PubMed, which now lists only the paper's title with no abstract. This at least is a lesser evil than outright blacklisting of the paper. Climate change and HIV/AIDS are both like a religion, each one with its creed, code, cult, and catechism. Leading apostles of the HIV/AIDS creed have been the ones shown here. Peter Duesberg discovered the first retrovirus oncogene with a co-worker and was considered the king of retroviral research until Robert Gallo at the National Cancer Institute deposed him. Gallo calls heretic Duesberg's work, quote, total and absolute nonsense. For the last 30 years, Anthony Fauci has been America's de facto AIDS czar. As director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, he holds the purse strings on billions of dollars for research, but only to study HIV. And he maintains close ties with the drug giant Gilead. Fauci deals with Duesberg this way, quote, don't comment about Duesberg for fear it will legitimize him. Dr. Fauci also makes sure that Professor Duesberg never appears on national TV by intimidating producers that interview him. When already scheduled, like he was on Good Morning America, who flew him from Berkeley to New York for the show, Dr. Fauci stepped in and blocked it and appeared on the show in his place. David Baltimore, head of the NIH AIDS vaccine research and a Nobel laureate, calls Professor Duesberg, quote, irresponsible and pernicious. Dr. Joop Lang, a Dutch HIV physician and researcher, was a leading advocate of pre-exposure prophylaxis. On Dutch television, he denounced Duesberg, calling him, quote, a lunatic. And then we have Mark Weinberg and John Moore. John Lorenzen, a Harvard-educated gay liberationist and AIDS dissident, has written 3 important books on HIV/AIDS shown here. In his defense of AIDS critics, published in the Gay and Lesbian Humanist, John Lorenzen notes that Dr. Mark Weinberg, president of the International AIDS Society, backs jailing HIV/AIDS deniers. And John Moore of Cornell University, in a letter to a young AIDS dissident, wrote, this is war. There are no rules. We will crush you, one at a time, completely and utterly, like they like to do with Willie Soon. At least the more influential ones. Foot soldiers like you aren't worth bothering with. On the history of homosexuality, John Lorenzen writes, quote, it has been ruthlessly suppressed in the West since the 4th century AD, when Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. Gay men have been shamed and ostracized, imprisoned, tortured, pilloried, castrated, beaten, hung, burned at the stake, along with heretics and witches. The death penalty for male-to-male sex remained on the book in England until 1861, and in Scotland until 1887. In the U.S., it wasn't until 2003 that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that state laws criminalizing sodomy and other private sexual activity are unconstitutional. Lorenzen also makes this point, quote, AIDS research serves the interests of the state by focusing on HIV as an equal opportunity cause of AIDS. This infectious, egalitarian cause exempts 2 primary age risk groups, gay men and intravenous drug users, from any blame in acquiring the disease owing to their behavioral choices, close quote. The Church of HIV/AIDS anathematizes non-believers by calling them AIDS deniers and AIDS denialists, which is its adherents, of course, equate with being a Holocaust denier. But they have it backwards. Dissidents are not AIDS deniers, they are AIDS realists. The Gallos, Kalikmans, and Coopers of the world are the deniers. They deny the fact that in the 1980s and 90s, HIV testing and high-dose AZT caused a homosexual holocaust. killing 140,000 young gay men just as their lifestyle, rightly so, had stopped being vilified and punished by the state. Dr. Etienne de Harven wrote a book titled 10 Lies About AIDS. They're shown here. Regarding lie number 9, there has been no AIDS epidemic anywhere in the U.S. or Africa. And with regard to lie number 10, of course, scientific discoveries are not made by consensus. Dr. Bauer's case against HIV is divided into 9 sections. Section 4.1 is on the predictions that have proved wrong, 13 of them. Like there's been no epidemic in the porn industry, no decline in the population in Africa, and after 30 years, no vaccine for HIV, despite more than 15 trials, each causing $150 million each. The U.S. government so far has spent $420 billion on HIV/AIDS programs and research. It is 10 times more than the $40 billion it spent on climate science that Dr. Hapala told us yesterday. Even adjusted for inflation, this is more than the U.S. spent sending a man to the moon. With HIV care, antiretroviral drugs cost between $17,000 and $21,000 per patient per year. The CEO of Gilead, John Martin, is paid $50 million a year, which makes him one of the top 10 highest compensated CEOs in America. This is a classic case of crony capitalism meets bureaucratic junk science. Regarding pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, investigative reporter Terry Michaels writes, tens of millions of mostly taxpayer dollars were squandered in behalf of Gilead, so the drug company could reap potential billions in new revenues by exposing untold number of HIV-negative people to toxic chemotherapy. One piece of good news is that this year the U.S. Military Appeals Court overturned an HIV conviction, which had sentenced this sergeant to an 8-year jail term for attending a sex party and not disclosing that he was HIV positive. Acknowledging the fact that the likelihood of heterosexual HIV transmission is close to non-existent, the court ruled that the evidence used to convict the sergeant was, quote, legally insufficient. The fact of the matter is, HIV tests are a crime against humanity and should be abolished. The bottom line is the catechism, HIV causes AIDS, has brought about wrong diagnoses, psychological terror, toxic treatment, and squandering of public funds. I recommend 3 books to read on this subject. The one by Rebecca Coolshaw, which succinctly deals with the science. Sheila Farber does a fine job of investigative reporting in her book, Serious Adverse Events. It is out of print, but Amazon has used copies for a cheap price. And the 16th anniversary of Joan Shenton's Positively False has just been published. It has the original 1998 text with updates and contributions from 20 journalists, writers, scientists, and clinicians, and I highly recommend it. There are 2 articles I've written on this subject that are available online, 2 other articles. Future generations may one day look upon Peter Duesberg with his revolutionary work that overthrows the genocentric view of cancer and the germ theory of AIDS as a modern-day Copernicus. This article spurred Rebecca Coolshaw to write her book, Science Sold Out. The other one deals with what Dr. Andrew Wakefield has undergone with vaccines and autism, and Peter Duesberg with AIDS. So in summary, to quote Shakespeare, time's glory is to calm contending kings, to unmask falsehood and bring truth to light. A fallacy of modern medicine is the HIV/AIDS hypothesis. Thank you.